Some of you may be asking, why are we here today? In other words, what are we here for, and why is this topic important to all of us? In this first module, we will be providing you with a brief overview to answer two key questions. What is the story so far? And how does the post-2015 process differ from the one resulting in the MDGs? By answering these two questions, we will introduce the key differences in how the MDGs and the post-2015 development agenda were crafted. Up first, what is the story so far? The post-2015 development agenda is the result of the convergence of two processes. This coming together was initiated by a consensus that emphasized the need to combine the processes surrounding the completion of the MDGs with those that were the outcome of the Rio Plus 20 conference. We can refer to these two processes as the MDG track, which is shown here in orange, and the Sustainable Development track, shown in green. Emerging from a series of international summits on various aspects on human development held in the 1990s, the MDG track was primarily about social development, with poverty eradication as its primary objective. The concept of sustainable development was introduced into the intergovernmental discussions around the same period in the context of processes focusing on the development-environment nexus. Although all the three dimensions of sustainable development were part of the concept from the outset, the discussions and the follow-up within the Sustainable Development Negotiations track emphasized the environmental dimension. Over the last 2 years, the inputs from both of these tracks were synthesized to form a single, universal, and comprehensive development agenda, now known as the Post-2015 Development Agenda, shown in blue on this timeline. This new transformative agenda integrates the three dimensions of sustainable development in a balanced way and calls for a new approach based on a number of principles that will guide its implementation. In short, many involved in the negotiations came to the common conclusion that the core objectives of both tracks, poverty eradication and sustainable development, are intrinsically linked. Therefore, a unified set of goals and a universal agenda had to be created using the inputs from both tracks. We'll revisit this process in detail as we move through the timeline. To make things clear before we begin, let's add an indicator of where we are today. You'll notice that there are milestones already showing on the timeline. We'll zoom in closer on each one as we move along. Now let's take a look at each of the two original tracks. To keep things brief, we will present the major milestones along each track, but remember that there is plenty more that happened behind the scenes. Let's begin with the MDG track. It's important to remember that the MDG track had a focus on social development, particularly on poverty eradication. It was formalized in the year 2000 at the Millennium Summit with the Millennium Declaration. This declaration became the basis of the Millennium Development Goals. These 8 goals were established for a 15-year action period, meaning that they will be drawing to a close at the end of this year. In 2010, member states assembled for the UN Summit on the MDGs. The outcome of this meeting was a renewed commitment to achieve the goals by 2015, and a request to the Secretary General to prepare annual reports on progress towards the goals and produce recommendations for beyond 2015. This marked the beginning of consultations with various stakeholders on the post-2015 agenda by the Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons and the UN Development Group, which we'll discuss a little later on. Building on these first inputs, the Secretary General released a report entitled A Life of Dignity for All, which put forward a series of recommendations for future steps for the development agenda after 2015. Before we look at how the tracks came together, let's have a look at what happened up to this point on the Sustainable Development track. Like the MDG track, the Sustainable Development track served to catalyze global development. The difference with the Sustainable Development track is implied by its name. It focused on how development can be accomplished in a sustainable manner. In practice, and in the absence of a truly integrated approach to development, this division of responsibilities led to a situation where the negotiations under the Sustainable Development track focused more on the environmental dimension rather than on the other two. The 1992 Rio Summit became a milestone when world leaders committed for the first time to promoting sustainable development and agreed on an action plan, Agenda 21, and a number of main principles. At the same time, 3 major environmental conventions were open for signature to foster a change in the traditional approach to development. 10 years later, a major follow-up summit took place in Johannesburg, South Africa, commonly referred to as Rio Plus 10. The focus of this meeting was on producing a plan for implementation. The Johannesburg Summit reiterated the social and environmental objectives reflected in the MDGs and Agenda 21, and also recognized widening inequalities in the context of globalization. It contributed to the MDG 7, including through a target on sanitation, and spurred a number of voluntary initiatives. In 2012, world leaders met again in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for the Rio Plus 20 conference, and adopted an outcome document entitled The Future We Want. The main objectives of the Rio Plus 20 conference were to secure renewed political commitment to sustainable development, assess the progress to date and the remaining gaps in the implementation of the outcomes of major summits on sustainable development, and to address new and emerging challenges. Rio Plus 20 also addressed the integration of the 3 main dimensions of sustainable development, that is, economic, environmental, and social, through its 2 primary themes. Its first being a green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, and the second being the institutional framework for sustainable development. Several mechanisms were created in follow-up to the Rio Plus 20 decisions, including the Open Working Group, tasked with the drafting of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Intergovernmental Committee of Experts on Sustainable Development Financing, with the aim to propose a financing strategy, and the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, to provide political leadership and to review progress on the implementation of sustainable development. Now that we've seen the key features of these 2 tracks before the convergence, let's see how they came together. Recall again why the tracks were merged. A consensus that the priorities of both tracks, being poverty eradication and sustainable development, are intrinsically linked, and therefore a single universal development agenda should be created. This holistic approach was discussed and agreed upon during the General Assembly special event in September 2013, when member states recognized the intrinsic linkages between poverty eradication and sustainable development. As a result, they agreed to have one set of goals, and to launch intergovernmental negotiations on the Post-2015 agenda at the beginning of the 69th session of the General Assembly, which will culminate in a Heads of State Summit in September 2015. The agreement also requested that the Open Working Group and the Committee of Experts, both of which were created at Rio Plus 20, complete their work by September 2014, and the Secretary General prepare an overall synthesis report as an input into the Post-2015 negotiations. The idea was that a new set of global goals would form the basis of the Post-2015 development agenda. Of course, the agenda is more than just a set of goals. Also needed are guiding principles, targets, indicators, implementation means, and monitoring and review measures. Let's now explore the steps after the convergence of these 2 tracks. By July 2014, the Open Working Group had finalized its proposal for a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, along with a total of 169 associated targets. Then, by August 2014, the Committee of Financing Experts produced a set of recommendations on sustainable development financing. This enabled the Secretary General to submit his synthesis report by December 2014. This report combined the full range of inputs from both tracks. Building on the SDGs proposed by the Open Working Group, it provided 6 essential elements that could frame and reinforce the agenda. Member states agreed that the proposed SDGs would form the basis for intergovernmental negotiations on the post-2015 agenda that began in January of this year and will continue into July. So that's where the agenda stands as of today. Now, let's take a look at 3 important upcoming events. The first is going to take place as part of a major related complementary process that runs alongside the post-2015 agenda and focuses on financing for development. The third International Conference on Financing for Development, organized in follow-up to the Monterrey Consensus and Doha Declaration, will take place this July in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Negotiators will likely be looking to find ways to increase resources and capacities for implementing sustainable development while creating an enabling environment and addressing its three dimensions: social, economic, and environmental. Then, in September, the post-2015 intergovernmental negotiations are due to culminate in a summit at the level of heads of state and government who will come together to agree on the agenda. The third event is part of another complementary process known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, and its 21st Conference of the Parties, or COP21, which will be held in Paris from the 30th of November to 11th of December of this year. COP21 will include negotiations towards a legally binding global agreement on climate change. Such an agreement is explicitly mentioned in the proposed SDGs, and the UNFCCC is acknowledged as the primary forum for these negotiations. So there you have it, a quick look at the major milestones so far and what to expect in the near future. You should now be able to articulate how and why the MDG and Sustainable Development tracks came together and identify some of the main milestones in the post-2015 process. A prominent question we often hear is, how is the post-2015 process different from the one resulting in the MDGs? We'll be going into a bit more detail on the differences in scope and principles in Module 2, but for now we'd like to show you how the creation of the agenda was different from the MDG process. To begin, it's important to point out that the negotiations to draft the post-2015 agenda are being led by member states. The MDGs, on the other hand, were crafted as a standalone document by UN staff, drawing on targets from the Millennium Declaration, which in itself was adopted by member states. Where the post-2015 process differs even more is in how it enabled many groups of stakeholders to provide their inputs into consultations. Let's have a look at them now. In addition to member states, 6 broad groups of stakeholders can be identified who provided their inputs through, first, the consultations of the Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons, second, those facilitated by the UN Development Group, and third, consultations with major groups and stakeholders organized by member states. First, we have UN institutions. United Nations institutions provided their inputs through the UN Task Team, which is an interagency group of 60 UN entities and other international organizations. Next is business and industry. Business and industry contributed to the Open Working Group and post-2015 negotiations, owing to the fact that they're a part of the definition of major groups and other stakeholders. They contributed to other consultations through the UN Global Compact and UN Development Group. Moving along to civil society and people. Inputs from civil society and people come from several very important sources. In terms of the Open Working Group, followed by the post-2015 negotiations, inputs came from groups like children and youth, farmers, indigenous peoples, NGOs, women, and workers and trade unions. Civil society and people were also consulted through the global conversation led by the UN Development Group, including thematic and national consultations, dedicated dialogues on implementation, as well as an innovative My World survey, which counts over 7 million offline and online respondents so far. Inputs from regions were also included. The regional perspective was reflected in the consultations led by regional commissions. Next is science and academia. Inputs from science and academia come through the Open Working Group and post-2015 negotiations, which refer to these groups as the scientific and technological community. Inputs also come through the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, the UN Development Group thematic consultations, and others. And finally, we have political leadership. The consultations of local authorities, as one of the major groups, were conducted through the Open Working Group and post-2015 negotiations. The consultations of national leaders, including those from governments, business, and civil society, were conducted through the Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons and through the UN Development Group consultations. So you can see that this process involved the inputs of many groups, not just member states. It is this universal participatory process that has been so positively evaluated so far. Considering the diversity of input, the hope is that these stakeholder groups will feel a stronger sense of ownership in the implementation stage. And with that, we hope we have answered the 2 frequently asked questions we showed you at the beginning. We hope you now have a strong desire to continue onward and learn a bit more about the principles behind the Post-2015 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. And of course, we hope this will spark a discussion about how this will impact your work and development policies in your country for 2015 and beyond.